Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak today. So what I'll be covering in the next 10 minutes or so is what is the role of physiological scientists? So if we were to move from this animal-based diet to a plant-based diet, how can physiological scientists, how can we support this change? So just a couple of conflicts of interest to declare before I start. I have current and ongoing projects with the food industry, which have no relationship to what I'm talking about today. And I'm also a member of the Bezos Centre for Sustainable Protein at Imperial, which I will be talking about later in the presentation. So what happens then? So what are the major macro and micronutrient changes if we were to all adopt, or at a population level, suddenly adopt these wonderful diets that we've heard about in the previous talks? And really, what is the role of physiological scientists? How can we help guide or mitigate some of the risks that would be found in terms of some of the nutritional inadequacies? And really what I hope to really want to emphasise is really touching on how do we get to this win-win situation, which was touched upon in Nita's talk. How can we actually guide the development of a food system that is beneficial to both the planet and for human health? So for the purpose of this presentation, rather than go over, I was hoping that this would be covered in great detail, it already has. So what do we mean by a sustainable diet? Essentially, less animal-based food, more whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and plant and alternative protein sources. So if this was to occur, what would be the major macro and micronutrient changes? So in terms of carbohydrates, we'd see an undoubted improvement in carbohydrate quality. So fiber intake would increase due to this greater intake of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. We'd also see a dramatic reduction in saturated fat intake, as sort of animal fats and processed meats, which are the most common source of saturated fat in the diet, would then decline. In terms of protein, it would be anticipated that total protein intake wouldn't actually shift that much from animal-based diet to plant-based foods. But what we have to remember is that certain plant-based sources have a lower digestibility and bioavailability than animal sources. In terms of micronutrients, because of this, say, increased intakes of fruits, vegetables, and nuts, there would be a greater intake of many micronutrients. Just summarize these into folate, vitamin C, and magnesium would be three of the most likely increases in micronutrients. But there'd also be risks of reductions in certain micronutrients, particularly iron and B12 found in meat and dairy products. And one to also touch on is iodine. I never know if to say iodine or iodine. I'm going to go with iodine. You've struggled with that obviously in the past. So iodine, which in areas with iodine deficient soil, for most people in this area, dairy products are a major source of iodine. So if you were to stop drinking dairy products, you could get a reduction in iodine intake. So if these macro and micronutrient changes were occur, if a population eating lots of red meat and dairy products was to all of a sudden adopt this plant-based diet, how as physiological scientists, what could we measure to look at the changes in health? So for the first example, we'd want to track how changes in dietary fiber, how has this impacted our gut health? So dietary fiber intake is strongly associated with reduced incidence or risk of developing cancers and other non-communicable diseases. One of the key mechanisms through which fiber has this benefit is through your effect on your gut microbiome. So if a population was to shift to this sort of plant-based diet, we would want to track longitudinally, take repeated stool samples from individuals to look at how this has affected your gut microbiome composition and metabolites that are associated with improved gut health, and perhaps certain markers that you can look at of gut intestinal inflammation. We then want to see how this change in your stool sample actually, how has that affected you, the actual systemic metabolism. And one of the key mechanisms that fiber has by improving your health is by lowering your blood glucose levels. So this reduced incidence of type 2 diabetes that's been touched on in the previous two talks. So as physiologists, we could look at changes in glucose in the home environment by using continuous glucose monitoring or validated lab-based tests such as oral glucose tolerance tests. So this other robust health benefit, which has been touched upon of a plant-based diet, is this reduction of vascular disease. So if we were to stop eating this lovely looking red meat with its rich and saturated fat, we would want to see how has this actually longitudinally, how has this actually changed your risk of CVD? So again, we could take longitudinal blood samples to look at changes in cholesterol, particularly like your HDL and LDL ratio, and various other lipoproteins that are strong predictors of cardiovascular disease. And as physiologists, we also have validated tests to look at how these changes in the biomarkers, how are these actually related to your vascular function. So we could do occlusion cuff methodology or ultrasound methods to see how this diet, how has that actually improved your vascular function. As previously mentioned, we would be interested in this change in protein digestibility on a plant-based diet, so compared to animal sources, and if this has any impact on your skeletal muscle. So as I said, it's not thought that your total intake of protein is altered on a plant-based diet. It's just that it's not as readily digestible and absorbed. So what we would want to do in a randomized controlled trial is to look at, well, how has this actually altered your amino acid availability, particularly in a post-fed state, as that is one of the main anabolic stimuluses that keeps your muscle growing and keeping it repaired. So what we would want to track, again, if a population was to move to this plant-based diet, is to confirm that there hasn't been actually any changes in muscle mass and associated strength. That would be something essential to actually track. So in terms of undoubted risks of a plant-based diet, and again, this has fortunately been covered previously, it's this risk of iron and particularly B12 deficiency. So if you're not taking, suddenly massively reduce your meat intake, you're taking and reducing your animal dairy products, or your alternative dairy products are not fortified, you will get reductions in your iron and B12 intake, which leads to a risk of anemia. So again, it would be very important to track longitudinally in blood samples changes in ferritin, so as a marker of your iron storage, and B12 levels. And we want to look at anemia risk, so look at your red blood cell count and your hemoglobin. And in terms of functional tests that could be performed, anemia obviously, red blood cells and hemoglobin have this essential role in oxygen transport. It would be very nice to actually see, well, has this actually altered people's maximal oxygen uptake? So actually their ability to actually carry oxygen within the body and its association with physical performance. But really at a more population level, this is likely to be relatively minor risk. There's going to be specific vulnerable groups with existing levels of high deficiency where this is going to be a greater risk. So children in lower income countries, and particularly pregnant women where iron deficiency is around 30 to 40% already. If in this group you're going to then suddenly say eat less red meat and dairy, we could see greater incidences in anemia, which could have major clinical impacts in terms of pregnancy complications. So again, that's going to be something that's essential to track. And on the risk side, again, it'd be nice to actually track changes in iodine deficiency. I'm going to switch to iodine so I please everyone. So again, in certain parts of the world, in parts of Europe and in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have iron-deficient soil, animal dairy, that's a very high, rich source of your iodine. And iodine is very important for the production of your thyroid hormones, particularly T3 and T4. So if we were to move from our sort of animal-based diet to one that's plant-based, we'd want to take repeated spot urine samples to look at iodine levels, to look at iodine deficiency, and pair this with blood samples to look at changes in thyroid hormones. And again, a functional test that could be performed alongside this is that these thyroid hormones have a wide-ranging roles on energy metabolism, but one role they have is on basal metabolic rate. So what we'd be able to track is if changes in thyroid hormones, are they actually associated with reductions in basal metabolic rate? But again, similar to iron and B12, this is more likely to be a risk factor for particular vulnerable groups. So in children of school age in sub-Saharan Africa, iodine deficiency is in 30% of individuals. So again, it would be very important to track in specific populations rather than in the general population. So hopefully I've managed to persuade you that physiological scientists really have an important role if we want to move from animal-based diets to these healthy sustainable diets. So we have the validated tools and methods to really look beyond sort of models or estimates of effect to actually look in the real world, what's the actual impact on health if we to actually adopt these diets. And I hope I've managed to convince you this is far from a straightforward win-win state. Whilst there are undoubted benefits of these sustainable diets through like higher fibre intake and lower saturated fat intake, which for the general population would have massive benefits for prevention of non-communicable diseases, there are going to be specific vulnerable populations, say children and pregnant ladies, what a terrible term, pregnant women, where there's already high deficiency of certain micronutrients, iron, B12 and iodine, where for changes to a sustainable diet could actually cause major complications and health risks which need to be managed. I'd like to finish by mentioning some of the work that's being done in this space at Imperial College London. So launched last year, this is the Bezos Centre for Sustainable Protein, which is being led by Dr. Rodrigo Ledesma Amaro. So this is collaboration between academics in 7 academic departments, so from bioengineering, nutrition, and AI and machine learning. And really what this work's focused on is trying to develop novel sustainable proteins in the area of particularly of fermentation and cultivated meat technologies. But the reason why I mention this, it's the role as in the section of nutrition have in this. This isn't just about creating new sustainable protein sources. These are always paired with academics in the section of nutrition, so we will design appropriate clinical trials to actually validate these novel sustainable proteins. So using some of the methods and biomarkers that I've said, looking at things like their digestibility and impacts on micronutrient intake. So really it's hopefully quite a nice example of how physiological scientists can work with bioengineers and the food industry so that if novel products are created to actually improve planetary health, that we can actually also help support this win-win situation so that they are beneficial to human health as well. Thank you very much.